And our next speaker is from Absa. Henry Botha is the head of strategy and business analytics at Absa Group. He's going to be talking to us about the total cost of ownership of electric vehicles in Africa. And he's here with us in studio. Henry, how are you?
Hi, good in you, Kriya.
Good to have you with us. I'm going to leave you here. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. Right. So I think over the past day and a half, we've heard a lot of policy discussions and everything that goes into what can get EVs onto our road. So I thought best to then focus on what the total cost of mobility looks like and how finance plays a role in getting EVs introduced into South Africa. Now, the focus is mainly South Africa. The focus is mainly on the consumers and what vehicles they buy. But I think you'll find that the use cases applied in what I present today can be applied somewhere else. Could be done in a different country in Africa and also can be applied on the commercial spaces in vehicle financing. So if I can then continue and just do a brief introduction as to why this is so important. On the introduction side of that slide, you can see that EVs is important. We've got 10% of pollution in South Africa emanates from vehicles. 90% of that pollution actually comes from petrol and diesel in those vehicles. We've signed a treaty, the Paris Agreement of Climate Change, where we commit to have 2.9 million EVs on South African roads by 2050. Now, that's a lot if you consider that we've got just about, I think, 12 million vehicles currently on SA roads. That's a significant step up over the next 30 years. Now, in order to start explaining how finance features in here, we need to understand how the cost of mobility works. If you go and buy a vehicle today, you do an average of 20,000 kilometers per year, then about half of that cost per month is related to the depreciation of the vehicle. The rest, the other side of the pie, relates to your everyday use of that vehicle. That you finance it, then there's finance costs involved. That's only 5% of the cost of mobility. Your fuel cost, maintenance cost, and then insurance and other maintenance that comes in, like preparing a windshield or a rim tire that has hit a pothole. Now, what you can do with EVs and the introduction of EVs is attend to the fuel, how that can be reduced, the maintenance cost of the vehicle because of fewer components. But also, if electrical vehicles have 1 million kilometers per battery, if they have fewer components that can fail, you could also look at depreciation decreasing. And depreciation playing, having a smaller size of that pie that you see on the graph. And I'll take you through how that is possible. Next up, let's understand in a developed market like the USA, where EVs have been on the road for a longer period. We did a comparison between a A200 sedan, Mercedes A200 sedan, what its purchase price is compared to a Tesla Model X, Model 3 actually. And you can see that the initial price difference is quite substantial. But over time, once it hits 60,000 kilometers, you've maintained the vehicle, you've spent much less on fuel, then the EV starts breaking even. And after that, your electric vehicle becomes more cost effective to own on a total cost of ownership. Now, the reason for that is the lower maintenance, as mentioned, but also if you look at the second line from the bottom, what is the impact of fuel? So given what it costs from Eskom to charge a vehicle and what it costs per fuel when you go to a fueling station, you could actually drive per kilometer at a third of a cost than what it is using diesel or petrol. So what's the EV status in South Africa? As it was end of last year, there were 134 charging stations. And if I go to the barriers that have prevented from more adoption of EVs, there's been a limited number of vehicles available that you can purchase. So that's been the biggest, I think, issue. We saw on a poll this morning, most people opted and voted for if only the price of the vehicle can be reduced, there would be a much bigger adoption. Another reason for barriers that remain are electrical vehicles are also subjected to what Mike Mabasa referred to as the import tax that's levied on top of them. And given that most of these electric vehicles were expensive vehicles, higher value vehicles, they had an additional tax levied on them. Then electricity consumption, if you have to charge your vehicle, it would put an additional load on the South African grid that's already under strain. So there's a hesitancy that you might get home at night, plug in your vehicle, but you are then under 4 hours of load shedding. And the next morning when you want to drive to work, your vehicle hasn't been charged. And then, as I said, the biggest problem is the EVs we've seen in South Africa have been above R1 million. There's been two examples that I've known about, the BMW and the Nissan Leaf, that have come in below that price point. But compared to other vehicles, they still at quite an expensive price point. So the recommendations align import duties between EVs, so that it becomes between EV and ICE vehicles, so that they become more pro EV adoption, enhance our public charging infrastructure and fast charging stations. And then the one I'm going to focus on is encourage local grid infrastructure. So charging at home, setting up infrastructure, that Kabelo also shown quite early in his presentation. If you're able to do that, then you don't have a dependency on the grid. So getting into finance options. This is a brief history of what finance looked like in South Africa over the past 30 years. I'm not going to go pre-80s, but just to maybe give a voiceover is, before the 80s, you had to finance your vehicle over 24 months and you had to put in a 30% deposit. So imagine that today. I don't think anybody will be able to finance their vehicles. We've progressed gradually from 54 months to 60 months, 72 months, and there are even options available now where you can finance a vehicle over 96 months. That's a long time to pay off for one vehicle. Over the past 20 years, there's been the introduction of guaranteed future values. So the question was previously raised to Mike, what is the adoption of lease agreements in South Africa? The lease agreement doesn't really exist for the consumer because of our tax regulations and the way that the National Credit Act has been written. So it's been written in a way that we want consumers to own their vehicles. To have an option available for consumers who don't want to own their vehicles, these guaranteed future value schemes have been created, which generally over 24, 36 or 48 months, you're able to buy a vehicle and then know that at the end of that period, you can hand back the keys and the vehicle. And as long as it's in the right condition and on certain kilometer restrictions, you can walk away from that deal. So none of these really give EVs, an advantage. An electrical vehicle is the same. Anyway, it's financed. There's no benefit that the EV bring to a finance agreement. But what we could look at, if you look at the future options, are renewable energy finance options. So how do you finance both the electrification or the solar installation in the home together with the vehicle? Those have been mentioned a few times. Applying tax incentives into the financing cost. So buying an EV, get a benefit on your interest by applying that tax incentive. Or there could be company fleet solutions. We've seen, I think yesterday, there were a few e-scooter solutions that were made available as fleet vehicles, and then you subscribe to that vehicle for the usage of it, and you can then use it in your business to transport people. Just waiting for the next slide to appear. Okay, so looking elsewhere outside of South Africa, what has been done in terms of financing EVs? There isn't much of specific EV products. There's a lot of advertising that finance your EV that I saw in the UK, US, Australia, and there's benefits to it, but none of that benefit came through the cost of that finance. It came through either a government incentive, like in Australia, there's a fund made available, 10 billion rand, and that fund is then applied to give a 0.7% reduction in the cost of financing. Now, given what it costs in Australia to finance a vehicle, it is as low as what South Africa interest rates are currently. So 0.7% is quite a big impact on the interest, but it doesn't have a really big impact on the cost of that vehicle. The incentives, as I said, are applied either to finance or rebates. And then the other option is to look at the depreciation of the vehicle. In other words, instead of guaranteeing only 40% of that vehicle's value after 3, 4, or 5 years, you could make it a higher percentage and that way reduce the cost of that finance. Now, as of date, electric vehicles haven't yet stabilized in their used values, except for Teslas, which have shown to have higher residual value than what other vehicles have. And they've been able to apply that in their lease agreements. The other advantage, and Cabello spoke about that quite a lot, is the use of telematics, so that both the electric vehicle, the charging at home, all of that is smarter. Because with smart charging and a smart EV, there's a way to incentivize the use of that vehicle to lower the cost of mobility. If you look after the battery lasts longer. If you charge during times when electricity costs are lower, tariffs are lower, then you decrease the cost of mobility. So the consideration for South Africa is incentives, finance options for microgrid adoption. So let's finance both the vehicle and the PV at the home, financing the fleet and renewable energy office parks. So where, let's say, delivery vehicles, one-tonners, are used to deliver vehicles and they are stored overnight in that business's premises, you install EV infrastructure where it is most used, and then bring the long-term saving of lower maintenance. Currently in South Africa, we've got this benefit of higher value vehicles have either service plans or maintenance plans embedded as part of the purchase price. With the introduction of an electric vehicle that has lower maintenance, that initial price can be lowered to catering for that lower maintenance cost. So let's see how all of that becomes practical when we do some sums. So as an example, currently Absa has green asset commercial finance available. This is on the commercial side. It's not yet for the consumer, but it can be used as an example of what can be done for the consumer. So there are options available of 5 years, 7 years, 10-year terms that are available. And the financing is approved based on what benefit you get out of installing the solar panels at your business. So if you currently spend this much on energy and you're able to bring it down with PV, that difference is used to help with the affordability of that loan. Now, where to decide what vehicles are most likely to be adopted as electrical vehicles? I've taken the sales chart of 2019. How was sales split between all the different vehicles that's available in South Africa? And then I've highlighted where the adoption is most likely to happen if those vehicles could be put on the road at a similar price point as what their petrol or diesel equivalents are available. So starting with the commercial side, your sub 1 ton panel van, your above 1 ton vehicles, and your minibus taxis. If you add those up, they account for almost 100,000. That's 100,000 out of 600,000 vehicles fall into those segments. What will be required is the charging infrastructure at the premises where those vehicles spend the majority of their time standing still. So whether that be at a taxi rank or the premises where the vehicles are stored overnight. The retail options could be the fastest growing market, which is your MPVs, SUVs, crossovers. Those account for 140,000 of 600,000 sales over a year period. Now, that's the fastest growing market. It continues to grow. That was maybe equal to 10,000 vehicles some 10 years ago. So it shows a lot of promise. Also, the benefit, those vehicles are bigger and able to accommodate the batteries required for longer distances. And then the other one is the sub small and small. In the previous panel discussion, they spoke about the Renault Kwid, the EV that will be available in the Indian market, currently available in the Chinese market, and which is a much smaller vehicle and able to put on the road at closer price points at, let's say, between 200 and 300,000 Rand. So let's then focus on those highlighted in gray. What could a financing option for them look like? So this page, if you start at the top, it needs to have a couple of assumptions, because doing finance calculations, you need to just be sure what you're working with. So I chose a vehicle of 500,000 Rand. over 60 months, finance with a 40% residual, or as it's known in South Africa, a balloon payment at 10% interest, just to make my calculations very easy. And then the maintenance cost of that vehicle is R1.50 per kilometer, and the fuel cost is 91 cents per kilometer, doing 20,000 kilometers per year. So if I calculate that on a petrol or diesel vehicle, the installment would be 8,000 Rand. Your maintenance and insurance cost would be 2,500 Rand. Your fuel cost 1,500, and the total cost of ownership is a staggering 12,000 Rand. Now, usually when you ask somebody what does it cost to own your vehicle per month, they will just quote, well, my installment is about 8,000 Rand, not considering all the other items that add up to the 12,000 Rand, which is the total cost of ownership. If we take an EV as an example, and this is now an electrical vehicle scenario, we expect that vehicle will cost a bit more than its equivalent petrol and diesel vehicle, as we've seen the price points. So your installment is 1,600 Rand higher. But we then expect that you'll have a reduced depreciation. If those advantages of an EV vehicle, its longer longevity comes through. And this could even apply for a plug-in hybrid, which uses its petrol or diesel engine much less and therefore has longer longevity and fewer service intervals in between. So that brings us a reduction of 620 Rand. The next item is the insurance and maintenance. We expect all EVs to be smarter than what their current equivalent vehicles are. So with smart technology included in the vehicle, like telematics, being able to identify to the consumer that you are now charging it smart, you are driving it smart, you're regenerating energy through the way that you are using your brakes, etc., and your maintenance cost will thus decrease as well. Then the fuel cost, as I said earlier, an electrical vehicle is about a third of a petrol vehicle's cost to drive the same amount of kilometers, which then in the end becomes a 3% reduction in the cost of mobility. That's quite a significant improvement in driving around in a vehicle that has almost zero emissions and being able to afford it at a lower cost than what a petrol or diesel vehicle is able to do today. Now, the last scenario that I want to introduce is the one where you also install solar PV on your home, and you effectively become an ecosystem that's able to charge your own vehicle, making your fuel cost zero. So with that, you'll have a more expensive vehicle at the start because you need to buy the batteries, buy the solar panels that get installed on your roof. Part of this 30% increase in the price, I was hoping for a certain reduction with government tax incentives that incentivizes this type of behavior. The next one stays the same. You've got reduced depreciation, you've got reduced maintenance, and then you've got a 100% reduction in your fuel cost, being able to generate all the distance that you need to travel in your vehicle. And eventually it ends up with an ownership cost that is lower than the total cost of owning a diesel or petrol vehicle. If I can end off with a comparison, it's like buying an apple or buying a bar one. You both have very dissimilar, very different ways of how it reacts once you've eaten them, but you need to produce both. So your choice is whether you're going to own an apple or a bar one. And yes, I think the apple is a better choice if it comes at the same price. Thank you, Priya.
Thank you so much, Henry. I have a question. When it comes to Absa as a whole, what is Absa doing to starting or to encourage buyers to now get into this space as a financer?
So I think the encouragement really comes on the commercial side now, having the finance options available that recognizes that once you've installed PV in your building, that you're able to reduce your energy consumption, and that reduction in cost can be used to finance that solution. Currently, that's not available on the retail side.
Mm-hmm.
Because the vehicles and the tax incentives need to fall in place.
Mm-hmm.
Once we can get a vehicle that can be sold at scale,
Mm-hmm.
then the finance solution for that can be developed.
Okay, makes sense. How long do you think it's going to take us to get to to those points where we do have that number of vehicles in the market?
I think there will be a lot of developments over the next 5 years. If I look at the model ranges that have been advertised overseas that are likely to come to South Africa, the considerations of the OEMs as to what vehicles they want to bring to South Africa, I think it's an exciting time. The time is now. We were very excited 10 years ago, but the technology, the cost of ownership just didn't make sense yet. And I think that has now become available.
Well, hopefully the apples taste just as sweet in 5 years, right?
Exactly.
Well, Henry, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it. Henry's also going to be around for the conference and during networking sessions. So if you want to connect with him, then make sure you hop on to one of those networking sessions.